Just to start with, I think as the earlier presentation, when we talk about human capital, we are not just talking about the number of people. We are talking about what has been invested in people to make them more productive. Education is more important, as much as health, nutrition, and so on. Within education system, we know preschool is very important. Early childhood education is very important as a foundation for future education to make kids able to cope with school activities going forward. It is true that early childhood education has not received generally across the continent as much attention as primary education going forward. But it is imperative that we increase our investment in that area. The biggest challenge is that schools must be within the vicinity of households so that the kids that have to go to school can easily attend the schools and come back. In Tanzania, for instance, in order to facilitate this, we have started to have special classes that are actually outside the main schools to bring them closer to the population so that it will be easier to transport them to school and come back, what we call in Kiswahili shule shikizi. That is, you have a primary school in one area, but you can actually have classes run by that primary school, but even closer to areas of locations of high-density populations. It's a big challenge because we need to increase investments in terms of infrastructure and also in terms of training, the people will handle that. But for sure, if we really want to achieve in education, we must increase our investments in early childhood education.
Thank you, Professor Mkenda. I'd like to now reach out to Minister Ndung'u from Kenya. Let's talk about the demographic dividend or divergence. Africa's population, as we heard from Dr. DeBellin, is expected to be youthful throughout much of this century. And for many countries in the past century, youthful populations have been accompanied by increased prosperity. As Africa remains youthful, the rest of the world will be aging rapidly. By 2050, 1 out of every 3 people under 30 will be in sub-Saharan Africa. This means the demand for youth will be much higher outside of Africa. What does Africa need to do to maximize human capital utilization and realize the productive potential of its youthful demography?
Thank you very much, and I'm quite happy to be here and to be in this session. And in fact, yesterday I was asking myself this question, why now? Why are we concerned about the human capital development now? After almost 60 years in the average of African countries, the development planning period, why are we still now focusing on human capital development? But let me go back to the issue that you raised about demographic dividend. And when you look at even when Andrew was presenting, he's actually showing that the graph will start picking up at 2050 for Africa. And in a sense, I think I've seen several papers that are looking into this. In 2008, there was still a projection or a forecast showing that Kenya itself, for example, will actually achieve a demographic dividend in 2050. But somehow, we may need to come back and reinvest. I will look at the numbers again. Because we made an assumption that there will be, mortality rates will be declining, and so it means that the health indicators will be improving. But just, if you look at just that alone, if you look at the last 3-4 years, what has happened in Africa, it's actually devastating even to look at the health indicators. For example, the COVID-19, the second, the devastating climate change and drought has actually reversed the efforts of poverty reduction and even inequality to the last, perhaps just taken us like 20 years back. In a sense, you're actually saying the investment in those areas, especially in health indicators, is actually challenged. That's one. The second thing is that we anticipated that there will be better nutrition outcomes. But you can see when you talk about nutrition and poverty, you actually are showing that something somehow in this decade, the starting of this decade, we are challenged. And that is the anticipation that the dependency rate will decline so that there will be massive employment. And so the people who are young and old, as a proportion in terms of the total, the labor force will be like just greater than that. And so it means that we can actually ask ourselves, is the timing correct now? But let me say, what is it that creating my impression that there is pessimism in achieving this demographic dividend? First, let me say that just like Andrew, for me, I'm very concerned about institutional quality. Going forward, and even if you look at the last 20 years, the institutional quality in African countries, you can actually talk about actually declining institutional quality. The second thing is availability of productive employment. We have had several programs working with, for example, Latin America and even the Brookings, looking at even the youth unemployment. What may have happened? But what may have happened is that the youth unemployment comes in because there is a missing middle here. I looked at African economies for the last couple of years, and I could see that there was a massive expansion of primary school education and secondary school education and high school education. That's at the university level. In fact, today, there is a premium for you having a degree to the point where the crooked guys buy one because there is a premium for the degree. But what happened in some countries is that they destroyed the middle. That is the technical and vocational training, the TVET. We call it the TVET. In a sense that you get to the university, you don't get a job, and then if you went to a TVET, you would actually get to, and the majority of the people are dropping out. That is what I'm calling the missing middle. And we have to go back and ask ourselves, how can we reverse this? I've seen that, for example, in Kenya, they have started amnesty to reduce this. Because this is something that could have helped us in terms of focusing on the 2050 in terms of the demographic dividend. Actually, this is also something that we have covered with Brookings and wider. We studied 7 countries. We call them the 7 African lions. And we wanted to show that these countries have the potential to lead the way, but they are not leading the way. What is happening? And the summary point is also consistent with what Andrew has explained. What is happening to the institutions? What is happening to their markets? And what is happening to the human capital development index in terms of the way we anticipate it would go? And this is quite consistent with what I was saying. So the picture I'm painting is actually to show exactly what is happening. Let me stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ndung'u. And I want to come back to 2 of your themes when we come back to the next round. This question of pessimism in the demographic dividend and also vocational training in connection to labor markets. But first I'd like to, since you're talking a lot about the increase in investments in education, is turn now to Mr. Sadie. Talk about the quality of learning. Because yes, Africa, like much of the developing world, has made enormous progress in sending more children to school and building more schools. Unfortunately, the quality of education remains low across much of the continent, which lowers the human capital impacts of education. And of course, the learning loss during the pandemic further adds to that problem. How can countries improve their education systems to improve the quality of education? And how can digital technologies and platforms be used to improve student learning and to better prepare them for the future world of work? Mr. Sadie?
Thank you, Ian. Good morning, everyone. Very delighted to be here. Let me start with 3 very important things, very simple, that need to happen for the quality that you talked about to happen. First, you need to have teachers that are well trained that show up in school. And then you have children who are learning that also show up. And the third element is having the right curriculum. Now, these 3 things seem very, very simple, but unfortunately, they do not always happen. Today, 9 out of 10 boys and girls cannot actually read by the time that they reach age 10. And I insist on the word cannot. And that's in sub-Saharan Africa. In contrast, if you look at high-income countries, 9 out of 10 children can, and that's the difference, read by the time that they reach age 10. And this is where the problem begins. And this is why we are very focused on starting with the base. A lot of things can be fixed later on, but we strongly believe that it starts at the primary school level. And this is where foundational learning is critical in terms of trying to make sure that you have the quality that you need at that base, and then you use that base going forward. And as you think about that quality, I just want to talk about 3 proven solutions that we are advocating in terms of making sure that that quality is there. It starts with structured pedagogy, where you have an approach that enables you and help teachers to have the right kind of training and also the right materials in the classroom. And then the next thing is making sure that you have differentiated instruction. So you could have children in the classroom being in the same grade, but not necessarily at the same level in the different topics that they look into. And this is where you have to have programs that are catered by level so that they can learn the right way and grow as they learn. And the third element is remediation. And this was particularly acute during the COVID time when you need additional instructions, additional time for those children who are left behind, who were not able to be in a classroom when they were supposed to actually have that opportunity. And a lot of this is documented in the book, the Smart Buys book, report, which was put together by a number of experts who were looking at just some of these basic things that you need to do in order to enhance the quality of learning. And then on the second part of the question that you were asking, educational technology, which we call EdTech. Now, to be realistic, I want to use the word can. So it can actually make a difference, particularly when we talk about the issues of accessibility, of affordability, and quality, which are some of the basic barriers that we found in the field of education. And I use the word can simply because it does depend on the kind of infrastructure you have. Because today, very clearly, because of the fact that the smartphones, tablets, and other means are more available than they used to, it allows and makes it more possible to reach the communities that are basically remote communities and the ones that are not very easy to reach. And so that's the future. To the extent that those are put in place, it allows for scaling and to reduce the significant gap I've been talking about. So I'll stop here and hand it over back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Sidi. Minister Abudu, I'd like to turn to you now, and I'm so glad you're here with us today from Ghana. And I'd like to ask you about women's empowerment and outcomes. The already low investment in human capital is even lower for girls and women. which is reflected in lower educational outcomes during adolescence and beyond, in lower labor market outcomes throughout women's working lives, and often in reduced agency and voice in their homes and societies. What can countries do to improve these outcomes for women in Africa?
Thank you for having me, and all protocol observed. I want to limit myself in 3 key points: education, health, and entrepreneurial skills for women. Why education? Education is the bedrock of every life in any country. One philosophy says, if you educate a man, you educate an individual. But if you educate a woman, you educate the whole nation. And I cannot testify in this room that all the women that are in this room are well educated and they are still learning. Learning is a process, everyday process. If you are educating the girl child, educate the adult child, and educate the old child, who we are. Because the girl child needs to learn from the adult child. The adult child needs to learn to the older child. You don't have to limit it. It's a process and experience. We are here. A lot of women are going to gain experience. I'm going to gain experience from my colleagues, and that will help me translate into my country. Another key point, let's make education accessible to all, no matter your disability, no matter who you are. And in Ghana, the government have introduced a lot of school growing activities that retain children in school, especially the school feeding exercise that we are doing, which has targeted 3.8 million students. And it has given jobs to 30,800 caterers. And these caterers buy the food from the farm gate, and the farmer has also benefited. Economically, women have been empowered. So it is something other countries can look at. The free senior high school, where everybody's in school, you don't pay fees, you are given laptops, you are given bags, you are given everything for free. So now we have a lot of girls in school as well as boys in school. So we have to build on an introduction of innovation technologies. Now it has come to stay. We need to introduce ICT in our schools. So if you look at Ghana, we have opened ICT labs in most of the schools. And we have also opened science schools that we call the STEM school, that every region have a STEM school. And in most cases, they are only girls that attend those schools. So definitely, we'll have the nurses, we'll have the midwives, we'll have the doctors, and we'll have the nutritionists from those schools. So other countries too can leverage on that. We should also look at registry. We should target registry that will give us data for the poor girls. And this can formulate policies for government to subsidize whatever their needs are. So let's use the registry data to emphasize on women empowerment. Health, reproduction, let's look at that one too. What do we do? At the early stage, the child needs to be taught about reproductive system, how it works. The adult needs to be taught when she starts the conception period, how the body changes, and devices. Also, let's look at the old age. When we grow old, our hormonal system changes in us. You have the hot flash, you have your hair coming out, and in some African countries, people tell me to be witchcraft. And these are targeting the vulnerable women. And this will not yield to productivity. So we need to also train all these women to know about changes in their body. And we also have to bring education to the doorstep of the people, where we have to build more schools. We have to move away from theory and look at the practical aspect of teaching. China, they have developed because the people are taught practically. They feel it, they touch, they use it, and they produce something. Africans should look at that and also emulate those things. Our healthcare system should also be brought to the doorstep of our communities, where at least a woman pregnant will not, especially somebody who has the money to travel to bigger city, will have access to health facility within their locality. Then let's also try to educate people on harmful practices in our communities, where a woman is pregnant and they say you don't have to go to hospital because they will say it's not for your husband, it's for somebody. So they turn to the traditional birth attendants, and later on they have issues. But in Ghana, we have trained the traditional birth attendants and have given them kits so that if the women come there and they are able to deliver them, they will refer them back to hospital for more access. Entrepreneurial skills, the TVET, where technology is being taught, skills are being taught in schools. In my areas, I've realized that a lot of girls who go to the vocational training and are taught fashion designing, clothing, pastries and all those, when they come and they don't wait for the formal job, they start business on their own. So before they get other jobs or they continue their education, they have been empowered with some funding. So we have to leverage on entrepreneurial skills and also educate a lot of women on that. A lot of women go through practice like you don't owe a land. How do we leverage on that? I think women in this room can testify that me and you can own lands. We can own our husband because we are educated, and nobody would fault us for that. So education is key in building a human capital outcome. I will leave it here and wait for more questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Minister Buddha. Dr. Kaberuka, I'd like you to address the issue of human capital and productivity. And there are two parts to the question. How can we effectively invest in human capital development to enhance productivity and economic growth in today's rapidly changing and technologically advanced world? And second, what policies or strategies can be implemented to bridge the skills gap and promote lifelong learning opportunities, ensuring that individuals have the necessary capabilities to adapt to evolving job requirements and contribute to productivity going forward?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ian. Good morning, colleagues. First of all, let me say that the presentation by the chief economist was excellent. It raised all the issues, so thank you. But also, colleagues have made points here which I agree with, so I don't have to repeat them, because I agree with all of them. I just have a couple of points to make, and I'll be brief. The chief economist pointed to China and the way they have got everything right. I actually think the best example for us here in Africa is not even China. It is another small country, the south of Ethiopia, and that is Vietnam. So to give you an idea, the GDP of Vietnam in 1993 was just about $14 billion, $14 billion. The GDP of Vietnam today is just about $500 billion. $500 billion, from 14 to 500 in 30 years. Now, we can decide what has happened there, but those of you who are my age will remember images in the late 70s and the early 80s of people who are called the Vietnamese boat people. Do you remember? They were fleeing Vietnam in rickety boats, trying to get to Australia. Like some people try to cross the Mediterranean. It was the same. And that is not a long time ago. I was at school. But look, they've gone from 14 billion to $500 billion. Now, if you look at what is the secret, it's exactly the chief economist, what he was saying. The way they invest in human capital, plus attracting foreign direct investment. If you look at the structure of the exports of Vietnam, you'll find that about 40% of all the Samsung products are made in Vietnam. So, human capital, and you attract FDI, foreign direct investment. And so, what have they done to attract FDI? That is a question you have to answer. Human capital is one of them. But I was there about a month ago. I found also that they've reduced malaria incidence by almost 70%. Malaria in a tropical country by 70% because of investing in basic health systems. Nothing very sophisticated. They've taken a huge advantage of digital. And also, luckily for them, they have relatively cheap energy. But the key issue has been human capital and attracting foreign direct investment. Because that's how you create jobs. But here is an issue which we are not discussing enough, and I want you to, in the next 2 days, to take a careful look at it. Because foreign direct investment, we're all competing for it. But the first thing people will look at is how stable the countries are. Stability of the countries. Now, Latin America missed the demographic dividend. I don't know if Professor Ndung'u maybe later can say about this. Why? It was a very unstable continent. Debt crisis, macroeconomic instability, political instabilities, and they missed it. All right? And so it is very important we link up all these things together. And I'm glad you are raising the issue of institutions, because good institutions mean stability. I am on another panel, Ian, set up by the Secretary General of the UN on the Sahel. There's 100 million people in the Sahalan countries. It's called the International Panel on Security and Development in the Sahel. Now, many of those countries in the Sahel have actually, not in the free trade area, they have the highest form of integration possible. One currency, one central bank. So even integration on its own is not adequate. It is the secular instability of the Sahel which makes it difficult to attract foreign direct investment, even when you have one currency or something below it, maybe a common market. And so it is vitally important that we invest in human capital, but also in the environment which will make these young people prosper, which will make investment to be attracted. I mentioned Vietnam, but I can mention a few other countries in that region where the GDP has multiplied almost at the same magnitude because they are getting the dividend right. Now, two more small points in. I don't know how to say this because one of them is a bit controversial, is that I think too many of our senior policymakers are too distracted by issues around natural resources. They are distracted by looking for oil, gas, diamond, cobalt, whatever it is. And I do believe that probably this policy destruction is in DI. I wish it was given to human capital development. Because in that case, actually even the issue of natural resource will be managed by the same people. But if the attention of leaders focus too much on these things under the soil, all right, there's less attention to the resource which matters most, which is, of course, human capital. Now, the final point, I think, is controversial, Ian, so I don't know how to say it. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa alone, a concept I don't like very much, by the way. I don't like it very much. It's an artificial artifact to divide Africa into south of the Sahara, north of the Sahara. But since in the World Bank, this is a concept you use, I hope you'll abandon it one day. Because the countries I'm working on in the Sahel, a country like Mali, Niger, Chad, you never know, what are they? Because the word Sahel in Arabic, I live in Tunisia a bit, so I know a bit of Arabic. The word Sahel means a bridge, a border, a barrier. I hope my Arabophone friends here can correct me. I like to call it a bridge, but that's not the point. The point is that about 60% of all Africans live in about 6 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. 60%. So Mauritius can make progress, but how many are they? All right? But there are some big demographic densities where things will have to happen, because those are the engines. So the lack of Nigeria, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania here, South Africa, DRC, because these demographic densities are absolutely important, because they act as engines, as multipliers, but also they so can, I think, make progress. So I'm optimistic, because everything to be done has been said, whether it is quality education, health systems, all that we know. We should just care about and do it. However, it is important that if the free trade area were very hard working to make sure it succeeds, we create also a stable, peaceful institution which can attract foreign direct investment from countries who have got surplus capital. Now, there's one thing the chief economist could have said, but I'm going to say it for him. Please forgive me. You see, because of those demographics in the world, the countries we call the global north, they have got a glut of savings. Savings are accumulating. A country like Japan, even if the central bank puts interest at -3, the savings are increasing because of demographic shifts. But they are looking for a return. Now, that return can only be available in countries like ours. This is what the return is. All right? So, on one side, there's a glut of savings, very low returns, because of what they perceive to be the risk for us in the global south. So, the combination of making sure we have got stable environments, macroeconomic stability, political stability, is precisely to reduce the risk, which will enable us to attract the savings as investment to create jobs arising from this demographic dividend, which, by the way, lasts for a very short period of time. It goes away in about 40 years. So you have to catch it before it disappears. But thank you very much. These are my small contributions.
Thank you, Dr. Kaberuka. Since you came back to the demographic dividend, and it's one of the questions that Professor Ndung'u had started with, I'd actually would like each of you to reflect for a moment on, are you optimistic or pessimistic about this dividend? If you're optimistic, why? And if you are pessimistic, what would have to change to make you optimistic? And Professor Ndung'u, since you raised the question, I'm going to start with you, and then I'll go to Mr. Nkenda and go to... Actually, Professor Nkenda, you ready to start? Or do you want Professor Ndung'u to answer his own question first?
Okay. I was wondering, because when you switched to green, it talks. Now it was refusing to do that. Thank you very much. And I can tell you about the optimism, because I do believe that listening to yesterday and today, we have every reason to say, look, don't anticipate that everything has been going on well. We have had this critical mind in terms of trying to understand what is really happening. But let me offer two factors for this optimism that I do have. First is, I do believe, and this is something that I've heard for a long time, that growing the middle class is the one that is going to help us in terms of reversing this trend, especially the demographic dividend, the peace dividend, and all the dividends that you can think about. And that is something that we believe that the institutional quality and functioning markets is going to support. It's going to boost that middle class. Let me say this. For example, the new administration in Kenya has emphasized bottom-up economic transformation agenda. We call it BETA. The whole issue is, why bottom-up? Because so many people have been left behind and they have sunk into abject poverty. Why economic transformation? It's because capital accumulation, and that is consistent with what President Kaberuka has just said, the whole issue about capital accumulation is very, very important. And you can close the gap using, for example, foreign direct investment or even debt to try and grow the capital accumulation. But it has to get to thresholds that are going to ignite economic transformation. But we haven't managed to do that. That's why I'm saying the middle class is the one that can help us in terms of doing that. Why do I say this? First, they have a preference for peace. Second, they are the innovative group, and they are the investors at the domestic level. And of course, their consumption levels on average are much higher. And they are keen for markets to work. They are keen for markets to work because essentially, this is what I believe, that if markets are functioning, they are going to encourage growth, increased production and even productivity downstream, and especially for African farmers, smallholder farmers. And what you see upstream is actually increased incomes. That, for me, is a very, very critical factor, and is one basis of my optimism. The second one is actually going back to the drawing board in terms of nutrition, hunger, and even school feeding programs. Yesterday, we were presented with massive facts of showing that the first 1,000 days are very, very important for nutrition. But let's face it, African cities, arid and semi-arid areas, what they suffer most from is actually hunger. And I've seen that school feeding programs, in some cases where it has worked in Kenya, has actually increased enrollment rates in a very big percentage. So it means that will raise the enrollment, but it's also going to promote retention. Actually, urban poverty is actually pervasive in most African cities. And so it is a drag in terms of human capital development indicators. We believe that, but perhaps that's where there are incomes, but actually the poverty side is very, very important. I've seen studies that are linking school feeding programs to smart agriculture and to climate change. You can imagine that for itself, in terms of that linkage, is going to be very, very important. And that is why I'm actually saying that it offers some sense of optimism from my end. Those 2 points are very, very critical for me.
Thank you. Professor Mkenda.
Am I optimistic about Africa harnessing demographic dividend? I have qualified optimism, and a lot will depend on how we move forward from here. Sometimes we think it's just about the size of the market. Therefore, continental free trade area. Maybe size matters. How about Mauritius and Botswana in terms of population and the market size? And of course, Kaberuka said, well, I think sometimes we are focusing on natural resources, thinking that will take us forward. And then how about Korea, South Korea, and other countries? So let me digress and take a little bit of history very quickly and see the significance of this meeting and moving forward from here as Africa. It's commonplace to compare a country in Africa and a country in Southeast Asia in 1960s, Ghana, Tanzania, Kenya, and we look at the GDP and we find that they are almost at par. And that now we compare them and find that in terms of GDP, we are far apart. The problem with that comparison is a failure to look at differences in human capital accumulation at the baseline. What did they have in 60s in terms of human capital? Forget about the GDP. And how did they continue to invest and sustain high investment in human capital going forward? You cannot just compare two countries in terms of GDP. South Korea with thousands of years of statehood and also investments in human capital. So when we gained independence, there was that far cry, and I think it was Nkrumah who said, seek political kingdom first and everything will follow. And we recognize things like importance of education and health, dealing with poverty. Those were three key issues we were determined to address. So investments in education start to pick up. In Tanzania, for instance, we did not have a university. In 1961, we gained independence, but we established quickly a university college in Dar es Salaam with 14 students. We start to build schools and try to have literacy rate for all the population. Going forward to 1980s with structural adjustments. I'm one economist, and I know Kaberuka is, and Professor Ndung'u. But I'll talk about the World Bank. They came to us and say, return to education is so small, and therefore with the trickle-down economics, we should not waste too much time, resources in these activities that do not have high returns. We should reorganize the economy, and you lift the ship and all the boats will be lifted together. And we actually cut down on expenditure in education because we look at the returns to education. And the fallacy of that is that we are focusing on 2, 3, 4, a decade, years, instead of looking at intergenerational impact of capital accumulation that is the country like Korea and Taiwan had by 1960s when we tried to compare the two countries. When I talk to my colleagues from the World Bank, I say, when I see you focusing on human capital now, I'm so happy, and I know you're atoning for the sins of the World Bank bureaucrats in the 1980s and Bretton Woods. If we leave this summit with a commitment to continue to invest in education and other dimensions of human capital and sustain that investment, I'll have reasons to be optimistic about harnessing demographic dividend. If we allow the pendulum to keep shifting left and right and left and right, I think optimism will be misplaced. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mkenda. Very, very powerful, and I appreciate the emphasis on intergenerational impact. We are very tight on time, so I'm going to offer the final three panelists, if they have a comment on their optimism or pessimism, very briefly, we'd love to hear it.
Hello. I think I want us to look at inter-country trade. Let's leverage on that so that we can trade among ourselves within African countries. We can also look at exporting our human resources that we have within our various countries. If Tanzania needs nurses that Ghana can produce, why not? If Tanzania have doctors that Ghana need, why can't we do that? Intertrade, women in mining, what percentage do we know? What is the data of women in mining? How do we train them in risk factors in mining sectors? So we have to look at all those things holistically and come out with African solutions. I'm also looking at, in Ghana, we have something that we call Livelihood Empowerment Against Poverty. That's the LEAP program. And this program actually targeted the extreme poor within our communities. And women are majority. And then on one of the payment sessions, I went with my officers and we met a woman who lost a husband, left her with 6 kids. 2 of the boys were taken by the uncle, leaving her with 4 of the girls. They were dropouts from school. So we enrolled her on the LEAP program. Then the first payment of cash transfer, she went and bought guinea fowl eggs from the community, stood by the roadside, and she was selling. Now, she's the biggest woman selling eggs in that community. And she has been able to send her children back to school. And the last time I met her, she said, do you know, I now have suitors. They are coming for me. But I say, I want to take care of my children first. I said, oh, why not look at one and pay? He said, no, when they come, they will take my capital and they will eat my eggs. So she has built herself, she has empowered herself economically. And she now knows her right. We need to provide laws to protect women in businesses, women, girls in school. We need to get laws that will protect them. So I would like to say, let's look at inter-country trade, where there shouldn't be barriers, where we can all trade within ourselves. The ECOWAS trade, we should emphasize on it. And also try to bridge the gap between women. I mean, looking at us sitting here, there's a gender disparity because only one woman against how many men? So we need to look at that. Always, women, let's pull our colleagues, women, along, and one day we'll be there. Thank you so much.